Those of you who don't know me, my name is Kelly Cosentino. I'm the Executive Director from Volusia County Association for Responsible Development and its Flagler chapter. So we're a nonprofit organization formed to educate, establish connections, and promote responsible growth and responsible development in our community. So we're excited to host today's seminar, The Balancing Act, Growth, Conservation, and the Science That Connects Them. On behalf of the VCARD Executive Board, I'd like to thank our presenting sponsor, Hazen Construction, and to our breakfast sponsor, Waste Pro, for supporting this program we have for you guys today. Now, I'd like to recognize some of our community leaders who are with us this morning. So we have Volusia County Tax Collector Will Roberts, Victoria Bruce, City Commissioner of Winter Springs. Welcome. Deputy County Manager Suzanne Conchin. And Assistant County Manager Gus Zambrano. I just want to let you guys know that we have a lot of people from everywhere today. We have Brevard County in the house in the back. We've got Winter Park, we've got Melbourne. We've got a great crowd today. So before we get started, I'm going to have our presenting sponsor, Chad Hazen from Hazen Construction, come up for a few words. Chad, I'm just going to give you a brief overview. So Chad is the owner of Hazen Construction, a site development and infrastructure contractor servicing projects throughout East Central Florida, along with his brother, Mark. Prior to joining Hazen Construction, Chad worked for a large general contractor managing projects ranging from retail developments to complex-themed entertainment builds, Universal or Disney. He later earned his MBA from the University of Florida and now oversees the company's administrative and business operations. Chad also remains actively involved in community and industry organizations supporting responsible growth and strong partnerships with the development and construction sectors. Please help me welcome Chad.
That guy sounds pretty impressive. So I just wanted to say thank everybody for being here and to say that we're very proud to have worked with VCARD and so many great people in the community over the years. Speaking of years, this will be the shameless Hazen Construction plug. For those of you who do not know, we are officially celebrating our 25-year anniversary this year, which is pretty freaking awesome. We are extremely proud and looking forward to what the future holds for the company. So regarding the program, and what I find interesting is I run across people all the time that are like, this development's bad or that development's bad. And so I ask them, well, why do you think that? Because in my line of business, obviously we think development is pretty good. And usually when I press them, and if you know me, I tend to do that, there's not much behind it. And I try to explain that if development's done correctly, it's actually beneficial for everybody, the community, the environment, and the stakeholders. Which is why when this opportunity came, I was really excited about the program because it is truly a balancing act between growth and conservation. And over the years on our projects, we've had the pleasure of working with Mallory at Cohen because we've impacted wetlands and we've needed help, we've needed guidance, and it is a science to do it correctly. So for that, we're grateful. I'm excited to hear everybody. I don't know the other speakers, I haven't worked with you, but Mallory is absolutely fantastic and she has really been and provided guidance for us. So on that note, I'm going to turn it over to Chris.
Good morning. Chris Rowley with Cohen Associates. I am the current chair of VCARD, and I have the honor of being your MC today. We've got a great lineup scheduled, some great speakers. We're really excited for this one. And first, I'm going to introduce our first speaker, Clay Ervin. So Clay is a fourth-generation Floridian from Tampa. He has a bachelor's degree in economics and a master's degree in urban planning, both from Florida State University. And he has been a practicing planner since 1986. Prior to moving to Volusia County, in 1994, Clay worked with Panama City, Clearwater, and Coconut Creek. In Volusia County, he has worked for both public and private sectors, including Orem Beach, Port Orange, LTG, and Cohen Associates. He recently went to semi-retirement after 9 years as the county's Growth and Resource Management Director. He is using his part-time employment to further worthwhile endeavors, such as his educational program. He is fortunate enough to be married to his wife Karen for 37 years, and is equally fortunate to have 2 daughters who are 90% of the Ervin family payroll. Please help me welcome Clay.
Well, good morning, everybody. How are we doing today?
Good.
That's good to hear, and I'm very grateful for y'all being here, and I'm very appreciative for Kelly and Chris to allow me to kind of give the oversight on this. You know, you're going to hear from technicians who are going to give you the insights as to what and how to get through some of the environmental permitting. I'm kind of here as the city planner to bore you. No, to sit here and take you through the higher level policy that gives us why we have these regulations and these programs in the first place. I don't know if y'all noticed, but our country today is kind of polarized, you know, on everything from politics to sports teams to whatever else you want to talk about. And the fact is, environmental regulation has been the forefront of polarization since it ever became. And so we've all been there. Some of us probably tonight will be that situation. But what we're seeing is that you have such diabolically, just completely against each other's ideas in regards to some of these environmental regulations. So how do we deal with that? How do we handle the fact that we are going to have these public hearings? The fact is, right now, you can't change that guy's mind. His brain is gone. He's in fight or flight. He is not going to be able to be reasonable. So it's already too late when that public hearing comes in. So what is most important? Is it most important that we protect the environment at all costs, including violation of potentially people's personal property rights? Or are personal property rights at the forefront, and we need to make sure that they're protected no matter what? And that's why we call it the Balancing Act. That's why you hear judges in court cases saying that same thing. And why do we have to have the Balancing Act? And it's the goal of a sustainable development. It's the goal of a sustainable community. It's the goal of a sustainable state. And many times, those incremental steps to get there get lost. That's why I have the cartoon about the forest and the tree going there. Because right now, the gentleman who was screaming at his elected officials at that public hearing, he can't see whether or not that project's going to propel their economic forces forward so that way his kids have a great job. All he can see is that they're building right behind my house and I don't want it. And so the fact is that we as the professionals who are in the room have to be able to educate and be able to provide insight as to why this is a good project, why it is providing for that environmental lift, and how. My mind goes back to SeaWorld. Who remembers the 1 acre wetland in the middle of the parking spot at SeaWorld? They mandated that they had to keep that 1 acre. It had no habitat value, and all it was a wetland. And I don't mean to offend anybody who loves wetlands, but from an economic value, environmental value, you needed a better system so that you could actually have wildlife enjoying it. You had to have uplands. You had to have the complete system. I keep going backwards. Okay, so the goal is sustainability. Well, what is it? And I apologize for the cheesy effect there. And also the fact is, if you've seen this diagram or a form of it in prior years, this is every planner's dream. And it gives you the 3 main components that we face every day in our lives. You as political leaders, we as technical leaders, residents, look at this. It's a balance of social, economic, and ecological resources. And it's easy to find the sweet spot, which is sustainable, where the Venn diagram comes together. But the part that I really like to point out to people is, what is the imbalance when you don't have an economic aspect, but you've got social and ecological? So think through, if I don't have all of these components in equal force, then I am not going to be able to have a community where my kids can come back and live, because they're not going to find jobs. We're not going to have the resources so we have clean water, and we're not going to have the services we need, such as jails, schools, hospitals, etc. So that's at the heart of why we have a balancing act. So what keeps us from reaching that? Is it severely impacted natural resources? Is it lack of economic diversity? No. All of it is a lack of understanding and willingness to learn. What we have right now today is an opportunity for all of us to walk away with that much more information about wetland permitting and how it helps us. And if we can spread that information so that when we're talking, if you're a consultant with your client who wants to rip and tear the entire site, being able to explain to them why. I know it doesn't always work. When you're dealing with an angry constituent, if those of my friends who are in the public sector, being able to explain why that project's going to help out. Those are all the things that we, as the adults in the room, need to be able to do. And so now, I am done, and let the real smart people start talking.
Thank you, Clay. Thank you, Clay. Yeah, that was great. I actually have the privilege now of, my office is pretty close to Clay's, and I just go and sit with him and listen to him tell me all these great facts and knowledge, and I find myself in there for 30 minutes at a time, and I'm like, okay, I gotta get back to work now. But if you have not had the chance to sit with Clay and talk with him about anything, he is gonna help you explain the why. He's gonna help you find the reason to get there, or the yes to help you get there, and just everything that there is to know. There's just a wealth of knowledge. So our next speaker that I'm going to introduce is Mallory Tatum. So Mallory Tatum is the Director of Environmental Operations at Cohen and Associates, located in Ormond Beach. Mallory is a Florida native, graduated from Stetson University with a bachelor's in environmental science, and Bethune-Cookman University with a master's in integrated environmental science. Prior to ZCA, Mallory worked at the Marine Discovery Center on a clean water and healthy habitat initiative, and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration with the Caribbean Fishery Management Council, writing fisheries management plans. While at ZCA, she is an environmental scientist and a project manager assessing and navigating local environmental conditions and consulting clients to maintain environmental compliance. With a passion for coastal systems, conserving natural resources, and enhancing environmental stewardship, Mallory assists with landowners, engineers, developers, and local governments in analyzing ecological data, preserving protected ecosystems, and supporting sustainable development. Please help me welcome Mallory.
Well, thank you guys, and thank you, Chris, for having me, and Kelly for putting on such a wonderful event. I see a lot of familiar faces, so I'm going to talk to you about the environmental assessment process and what it looks like as an environmental consultant and how we deal with the environment before any development happens. So like I said, there's a ton of familiar faces in here, so this is either going to be really boring, but some of you may have ordered an environmental assessment from us or our firm before, so you might get to see a little bit about what that process looks like and how we deal with that in the field, and then what happens with that data afterwards. So we're going to talk about those processes that occur pre-design and pre-development, how consultants like myself, engineers like Bobby or Chris, and regulators like Mark von Canal assess the environmental impacts of a development, but then discuss alternatives and mitigation for impacts and ultimate design decisions. And we really want to ensure compliance with federal, state, and local environmental regulations, right? So keeping everyone happy, making sure that we're doing right by the state, the feds, the government, but also our clients. That's supposed to just... I had a really cool thing in Canva. It was going to be so pretty and flip through our environmental assessment. It didn't work out. But that's a report that some of you guys may have seen before. So our built environment. So I wanted to kind of talk about the need for development or the potential effects of development, but in reality, we are all using development right now. We all probably slept in our bed at home, right? We probably drove in our car or took some public transportation here on a road that was built and permitted to get through these environmental regulations. We might have stopped at a coffee shop or dropped kids off at school. Maybe took a shower with clean drinking water and clean water. Maybe we're going to an event this weekend at the Orlando City Stadium or at the Tortugas game. How many people got an Amazon package delivered yesterday? Right, so we need those at major warehouses in order to get those services and supplies and goods that we utilize every single day. We also love having people to answer the phone when we call 911, right? And come to our house if there's a need for police or fire, and those public services have to go through the same environmental assessment and the same permitting process that a private development goes through as well. Might have brought kids to the park, and ultimately we're here in DeLand at this wonderful venue, which I've never seen before, but it's gorgeous. But development starts with science-based decisions. So there's a graphic up here. This is a 1940s aerial. Can you guys take a look and maybe guess what this area is from the 1940s?
Speedway.
Oh man, good job. It is a speedway. So there's the next aerial from I think the 60s or 70s, and then what that speedway area or the greater Daytona Beach area looks like today. And if you see some of those darker areas that are showing up on the 40s are also still preserved in our current 2025 aerial. So science, design, and development. So we're going to talk about and understand existing site conditions and how it is going to influence design and ultimately sustainable development. The environmental assessment. So it's completed by trained biologists, scientists, and ecologists. It provides relevant database research of a project site before any development can occur. You've got scientists on the ground completing assessments, taking notes, usually in boots and hats, and we look completely different than what we look like today. But we confirm and document. We do a little pre-database research on GIS or some of our IPAC resources or FNAI that talk about listed species. We're going to go through each of the vegetation or habitats or ecosystems on site, document from a canopy down to a ground cover level. And then go through any potential impacts to protected species and any other species that may be utilizing the site. After we've done our field work, we're going to go through and talk about any impacts. And so that could be wetland impacts, it could be listed species impacts, it could be any protected habitats impacts. So the pre-development environmental process. We're going to look at soils, we're going to look at topography, we're going to look at habitats or ecosystems, and then ultimately the species that rely on those. And all of these factors can and will influence development. As soon as our engineers may know, some of you guys at Hazen may know, the soils on site, the topography is going to completely impact how your development can ultimately perform. And so our environmental assessment is that first step in the process. So habitats. So we've got uplands, wetlands, and surface waters. When we're in the field, we're going to be taking extremely detailed descriptions of each of those, and we're going to graphically represent them. Usually walking transects, or sometimes the easiest walkable line. Usually it's a fire line, which is really nice. Or if the surveyors have been out before us, that's the best case scenario because then we have an easy path to walk. And then we're going to track that rough extent of those habitats, and then we're going to take that information back to our computer with our GPS points and create a map that's going to be displayed in our environmental assessment report. So what is a wetland? So it's actually defined in statutes, and this was something that I didn't necessarily realize before I went to school to study environmental science, was that it's actually written in legal code. So wetlands are those areas that are inundated or saturated by surface water, groundwater, surface water or groundwater at a frequency and duration sufficient to support and under normal circumstances do support a prevalence of vegetation typically adapted for life in saturated soils. So Mark can probably rattle this off a lot better than I can rather than reading from the screen. But there's 3 key points in that statement and in that description. So water, so saturation of surface water or groundwater, vegetation, and soils, right? And so those are the 3 characteristics that we're going to be looking at when we're describing and delineating wetlands. So why are wetlands important? So they don't all look as pretty as this cypress dome right here. Usually they're pretty nasty, as some of the scientists and consultants in the room can testify. But water quality improvement, flood protection, erosion control, habitat for upland and listed species and wetland dependent species, but they also provide a lot of ecosystem services for us, for recreation, for tourism, for hiking, for harvesting, but they're also protected by the state, by the feds, and sometimes land development codes as well. So those 3 categories, our vegetation, our soils, and our hydrology. So when we're confirming and doing a wetland delineation, we're looking at those 3 categories in depth. And the consultants that you're working with, they're going to go and try and mark and demarcate the boundary, the landward side of that wetland in order to show it graphically. That way it can be used later. So we're going to look at vegetation. Are all of the plants in that system adapted for life in saturated soils? Can they be inundated by groundwater or surface water? The soils. So when that water table rises, is there evidence in that soil horizon of the water rising and falling? And then hydrology. Is there evidence of standing water? So that's visible on the trees, sometimes visible in that soil horizon. You might see lichen lines or visible staining on your trees. And so those are all the things that we as consultants are looking for in the field when we're delineating. So we're going to pretend that we're all environmental consultants right now. So we've got a wetland. We know about the proximate boundary because it's got some standing water, there's some vegetation, but we have to take GPS points of that. That way we can give that information to a surveyor and they can come behind us afterwards and pick up the exact location of all those wetland flags. So we're going to use this bright, pretty pink tape, that pink wetland delineation tape, and we're going to walk around the edges of that wetland, and we're going to tie pink flagging to each of those trees or wherever we may demarcate that boundary to delineate our wetland. So once we have all of our habitats listed out, once we've gone through each of the upland habitats, each of our wetland habitats on site, we can then think about species. And so we'll take a list of every single species that we see on a site, and not only protected species, but also things like armadillos and hogs and hawks, whatever we may find on a site, and then that will also get included in our environmental assessment. But a lot of times these habitats are directly influencing the type of species that are found on a site. So if we know we are in extremely dry areas, xeric oak, scrub species in the trees, we might have to think about things like scrub jays, and we might have to do a scrub jay survey. If we have a herbaceous marsh that has low-growing vegetation and a high water table, we might have to start thinking about sandhill cranes and doing a sandhill crane nest survey. And then our engineering team is going to have to adapt the design in order to avoid those areas. And the same for gopher tortoises. You don't have to necessarily avoid those, but we'll go through the permitting with FWC and do a 100% survey. And then if you're thinking about surface waters, it's important to know the difference between fresh and salt water, because there's different species that live in fresh and salt water, and you're going to have to go through different permitting mechanisms according to those types of habitats. So protected species. So within our area, the environmental assessment will document that presence-absence. And if we aren't already doing a gopher tortoise survey, if we aren't already doing a scrub jay survey, it will document that need. Or if we already did, it will document the presence-absence or potential territories of those species. In our area, species are protected by the state of Florida under the Threatened and Endangered Species Act, or species of special concern. the Florida Black Bear Management Conservation Rule, and all of these are managed by FWC, sometimes require permitting, sometimes require avoidance and minimization. At a federal level, we're talking about the Federal Endangered Species Act, or ESA, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, or the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act, and that is managed by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So now that we've documented soils, topography, uplands, wetlands, we've delineated our wetlands, we've documented any species, we might have done a species survey for whichever species may have been present or had a likelihood of presence. Now we can go back and look at our impacts, and we have to show avoidance and minimization. So we're going to work with our engineering team or our civil design team or the local land development to try and avoid and minimize any wetland impacts or any listed species impacts. We're going to offset any impacts to wetlands or species, and then we're going to provide mitigation so that there's no net loss. And Victoria is, I'm sure, going to do a great job of talking about those mitigation options as well. Once we've got all that, we can take that environmental assessment report and submit it alongside our construction plans and apply and obtain permits. So now that we've talked about that, we're going to go through a quick little case study, and I would love for this to be as interactive as possible. So you guys are a local government, and you have to design a road, but it has to go from A to B, and it has to avoid and minimize that wetland, and you can't impact that bald eagle nest, and you can't impact the 330-foot buffer or the 660-foot buffer, otherwise you're going to have to mitigate and get a permit or monitor for that bald eagle during nesting season. So the quickest route as far as construction goes would always be from A to B, right? But we've got wetland impacts. We're going to impact the buffer of that bald eagle, so that might not be the best option, though it might be the easiest to construct. But we're going to have to pay for wetland mitigation, and we're getting to permitting timelines, and it could increase the permitting timelines. Okay, so what about the next option? Okay, we'll skirt around that wetland, but in order to do that and meet the turn radiuses of the design, we're now going to impact that bald eagle nest, and we can't do that. So we would have to go through permitting, and that might not be the best option either. So we've avoided and minimized our wetland impacts, but now we're impacting a protected species. And so that's not going to be the easiest to permit or the most feasible. Okay, so what about the next option? We'll skirt both. You've got still some impacts. You might have some impacts to the wetland buffer, so you're still going to have to pay wetland mitigation, and you're still going to have to go through that increased permitting timeline, and you might not align correctly with where the local government wants to be at for their road. All right, so the next option, let's just move everything over. We'll avoid everything, right? No impacts to wetlands, no impacts to buffers, no impacts to our bald eagle's nest. But will it work for the local government? We're still not aligning from A to B. We're now really close to our neighbors, so is this going to work? And it may not. So we might end up going back to that first option because it's the quickest and the easiest, and there's no other feasible option in order to get from A to B. So now that we've gone through an environmental assessment, we've talked about mitigation, we've talked about permitting, now we get to the really fun part: civil engineering, design, stormwater calculations, state and federal and local permitting. And this is a project that we worked on in Daytona Beach, and this roadway, this is a good example of a road, avoided a large high-quality wetland in the northeast corner. And you can see a smaller wetland, isolated wetland in the central portion of that road. They were able to design the road and the stormwater ponds to avoid that larger quality wetland, that higher quality wetland, while impacting and only nicking that smaller isolated wetland. So the real fun, once we get past the environmental assessment, once we're done with the fun part of being in the field and doing those scrub jay surveys and relocating gopher tortoises, now we're going through the permitting process. And so this usually looks like a first submittal and then a review by your local government or by your state agency, and then they'll respond with comments, and then it's up to the engineering team and the environmental consultants to describe how the plan has changed or make changes to that plan based on those requests. And then we resubmit, and then we keep going, sometimes over and over and over again. And sometimes we get the permit on the next round. So it just depends on the project and the complexity and what that project is trying to accomplish. So Are we ready for development? That's the next step. So we've gone through our environmental assessment, we've gone through any mitigation, we've gone through permitting, and now we can hand over all of those plans over to the client and or the developer and or the landowner and start to build, right? So that's what I have for you guys. Thank you for your time. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you guys about what it looks like to be an environmental consultant. Hopefully some of you guys that have ordered an environmental assessment from us before have a little bit better understanding of what that process looks like, and would love to continue to serve you guys.
Thank you, Mallory, for that great description. I must admit that I work with Mallory a lot, and there was one site that I said, hey, I'm gonna come with you guys on this environmental assessment today, and I played in the mud as a kid. I can handle this, and it was 210 acres, and we started at 6:30 in the morning, and it was in July, and we had 10-pound boots on, wearing jeans and long sleeves and hats, and I about fell asleep at lunch afterwards. Like, I was sitting at lunch like this. And so I do not envy them. They get very dirty and very exhausted throughout most days, and then they come and look all dressed up like they do today. So they wear multiple hats. Our next speaker is Mr. Mark Von Canal. Mark Von Canal is the regulatory coordinator of the Division of Regulatory Services of the St. Johns River Water Management District. Mark brings over 30 years of experience managing and regulating Florida's water resources, both in the public and private sector. He has a dual bachelor's degree in biology and psychology from Tulane, University of New Orleans, Louisiana, and holds a master's degree in environmental science from the Florida Institute of Technology. Mark began his career in water resources in 1994 when he first joined the district as an environmental specialist. Between 2011 and 2014, Mark spent time in the private sector as a project manager for an environmental consulting firm, as well as owning and running his own consulting firm. In 2014, he returned to the district, and in 2019, Mark became the program manager for the agency's regulatory scientists, where he is responsible for the implementation and consistent application of the ERP rule with respect to environmental criteria, as well as the training and supervision of review of the most complex projects. In 2024, Mark accepted his role of regulatory coordinator, where he coordinates the district's ERP program with other agencies such as DEP, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and local governments. In addition, Mark works directly with the division director on all aspects of running the Division of Regulatory Services. He strongly believes in the district's mission to protect and manage Florida's precious water resources through the water quality, flood protection, conservation of natural system, and sustainable recreation and development. Please help me welcome Mark.
All right, it's quite daunting to come up after some of these great speakers, but I'm hoping that I can live up to your expectations. So I'm going to present to you a little bit of an introduction of what the St. Johns River Water Management District is, what the agency does, and then I'm going to transition into the ERP. I'm sorry, there we go. The ERP permitting program. And Mallory gave a great view of a great presentation of what it is to be consultants. I'm going to try to kind of give you the perspective from the regulator side. And Mallory and I have worked on many projects together, I think very successfully, and so hopefully I can give you some of that perspective. All right, let's see if this works. All right, so who are we? So the St. Johns River Water Management District covers about 18 counties in eastern, northeastern, and east central Florida. A little bit over 12,000 square miles, and our role is to balance the water needs for the entire states, the residents and visitors within the state. We were established in 1972 by the Florida legislature. There are 5 water management districts throughout Florida, and they are governed by a governing board. And there are 9 board members that oversee everything that the agency does, establishes our policies, hires the executive director, executes our regulatory responsibilities, and of course approves our budget. Right. So at the district, we have our primary core missions involve the water supply, water quality, flood protection, and natural systems. So our role as a water management district is to ensure that there's adequate water supply for both the people and for the environment. We want to protect any increases in flooding and maintain the district's flood control projects. So we do our best to ensure that there's no flooding or that flooding occurrences are minimized. We do work to protect our surface water quality and also natural systems. So speaking first a little bit about water supply, which is one of our core missions, the primary source of the water in the district comes from the underground aquifer, the Florida aquifer. The water stored in aquifers represents, is replenished or recharged by rainfall. And we, in our area, on average, receive about 51 inches of rain per year. Right now, we are under drought conditions, so it is definitely actually severe drought conditions right now. So we're experiencing water restrictions. About 38 inches of that water that falls in our district evaporates before it is able to reach the aquifer. Only about 13 inches of our annual rainfall actually recharges the aquifer. So it is very important to have a good policy and good water supply planning. So speaking of water supply planning, here we go. We do have 3 planning areas. We have the North Florida Water Supply Partnership. We have the Eastern Springs Water Supply Planning, and also the Central Florida Water Initiative. These planning areas are areas where the district collects data with respect to groundwater levels, springs, and also with the effect of groundwater withdrawals on wetland systems. So utilizing that data informs our decisions with respect to future water withdrawals and also developing alternative water supplies. So one of the best ways to ensure that we have water for the foreseeable future in Florida is through water conservation. So water conservation, of course, is minimizing and only making sure that we're using the right water supply, the right sources of water for the right uses. The greatest use of water is, or the greatest draw on our water supply is the waters that we use in our homes and businesses. So we partner with local communities to develop water conservation strategies and educate the public about the water restrictions and things that you can do in order to minimize and effectively use your water. Okay, there are also many water supply, alternative water supply options. That includes utilizing reclaimed water, developing local water supply sources, reservoirs, and also utilizing groundwater or brackish groundwater for converting it into drinking water. Surface water sources are also possible drinking water uses, such as in Melbourne and Cocoa, where the water supply doesn't come from the ground, actually comes from surface waters for many communities. So when we manage waters, we have to understand our management strategies are based on watersheds. So it's important to understand what a watershed is. It is the area where the water falls onto the land, onto the surface, and then collects and flows into rivers and creeks and ultimately out to the ocean. About 90% of the water quality impacts that result from the water in a watershed are carried in the first inch of rain. So that first inch of rain that falls onto a watershed carries most of the oils and the surface pollutants into the receiving waters. And that is why when we permit, for instance, stormwater systems, the stormwater systems are designed to capture that first inch of rain and treats it before it discharges. So it's understood. So the main sources of pollutions in a watershed come from the agriculture, industry, wastewater discharges, and urban stormwater runoff. So it's important to understand what those sources of pollution are so that we have ways to treat that runoff in order to protect our water resources. We, the district, like to make our decisions based on sound science. And in order to do that, our staff spends each year collecting many data points. We collect over 16 million measurements per year, which includes things such as the rainfall amounts, well levels, spring flows, surface water levels and fluctuations, and many locations where we collect water quality and measure and try to predict what ultimately the water quality will be. Ultimately, all that data helps to inform our decisions when it comes to water supply, water quality, restoration projects, and things like that. Speaking of restoration, we are involved in many restorations projects. Most of those restoration projects are to protect water resources for water supply and water quality. And here are just some of the examples, like the Lake Apopka Marsh Flowway project, which was recently completed. If you've been there, the Lake Apopka North Shore Drive is an amazing area where you can see lots of wildlife, lots of birding. I think every year we get thousands of visitors, and I think since we opened it, we've gotten over 200,000 visitors to the drive. Recently, also in the southern part of our district, in Melbourne, we completed the M1 Canal project, which eliminates a lot of the pollution that used to go into the Indian River Lagoon and collects it and now treats it before it gets discharged into the St. Johns River. Another thing that the district is very much involved in is managing public lands. The district owns or manages close to 800,000 acres of land throughout the district. Those parcels are either managed by us or managed by local governments or counties in partnership with us, or other agencies in some cases. When we manage land, we have a management plan for these lands that involves protecting the lands, enhancing the environment, and all of the lands that we manage are also open to the public and provides opportunities for fishing, hunting, hiking, bicycling, camping, and of course just wildlife viewing. So we make every effort to make sure that all these public lands are available to the public to enhance and preserve the Florida lifestyle. That brings me to permitting. So what is a permit? Mallory already gave you a really good a summary of what an environmental resource permit is. So permits are the ways that we ensure and regulate the sustainable use of lands. And there are a lot of different regulations and rules that go into the permitting process. A consumptive use permit, for instance, is a groundwater withdrawal permit that allows us and helps us to protect the water supply, like I said before. And of course, the environmental resource permits, which is the division that I work in, are permits that allow for the development of land in a sustainable way that protects our water resources while allowing a landowner to utilize their land to the best possible outcome. So again, the permits that we're talking about are the environmental resource permits. The ERP rules were authorized by Chapter 373 of the Florida Statutes and are described in Chapter 62 through 30 of the Florida Administrative Code. And again, Mallory and I are very much familiar with that code because we talk about it all the time. This rule provides the guidance for the design criteria and submittal of ERP applications, and the details are provided in the applicant's handbook. The specific criteria for individual permit issuance are described in that section 62 through 30 under sections 301 and 302. My division, the Division of Regulatory Services, it's a group. We're about 80 scientists, engineers, and their leadership team. We're located in 4 offices throughout the district, and we review and conduct compliance on ERP permits, mitigation banking, and also the FDOT mitigation program. We are very busy. In 2025, we issued approximately throughout all of our 18 counties 3,600 permits and permit exemptions. And that workload has only increased over the last couple of years. We're kind of on an uphill climb right now. Okay, so when is an ERP needed? So there are criteria in the rule that describe when somebody needs a permit. Those criteria, and this is not an exhaustive list, but includes things such as if you have 4,000 square feet of impervious surface that is subject to vehicular traffic. So those would be roadways, driveways, things like that, parking lots. Or 9,000 square feet of impervious surface and semi-impervious surface totally for your project. If you have a project area with a system that's an acre or more in size, or if your system can impound 40 acre-feet or more of water, or in most cases, any project that's in, on, or over wetlands or other surface waters. However, not every project requires a permit, and not every project requires what we call an individual permit, which are the largest types of permits. There are exemptions in the rule, which are certain activities that have been deemed to have what we call a de minimis impact or a minimal impact on the water resources, which include certain pipe and culvert repair replacements, maintenance activities, certain bridges, driveways, and roadway activities. This is not talking about building a new driveway or roadway, but this would be works within right-of-ways and minor activities that involve modifying or maintaining or repairing these areas. Certain recreational paths, and like I said, anything that's considered like a de minimis activity. Furthermore, there are several dozen general permits, which are permits that have a defined set of criteria that if the applicant meets those criteria within that general permit, they get that permit. So, and those general permits are very strict in terms of those criteria. So you either qualify, you don't qualify. If you don't qualify under the strict criteria of that permit, and you don't qualify for an exemption, that's when you need an individual permit. And so again, some of these examples of the general permits would things be like culverted driveways, road crossings, bridges, stormwater retrofit activities, and like public use activities on public lands. So ERP is not only administered by the St. John's River Water Management District or the other water management districts, it's also administered by the DEP. And there is an operating agreement between the DEP, the Department of Environmental Protection, and St. John's with respect to the responsibilities for permitting. So generally, St. John's has the responsibility for residential subdivisions, multifamily developments, commercial developments, roadways, certain docks and piers, and just a variety of other projects. Generally, DEP has the responsibility for single-family homes, activities within seaports, major industrial sites, mines, marinas, and utility lines. So oftentimes we have somebody contacting us about a permit that they need. We often speak to single-family homeowners, and then we politely direct them to DEP to help them. And there's plenty of work to go around, so we're definitely very glad to divide that work with our DEP partners. So once you are in-house for an ERP application, we review the documents that Mallory described, the environmental report, the engineering report, all the different activities, and the purpose of all those documents is to allow us the ability to review your project to determine whether it meets the permitting criteria. And under what I previously described, 62.330, which is the ERP rule, 301 lists all of the permitting criteria that your project has to meet that gives us what we call reasonable assurance that you can meet those criteria. And so I'm just going to quickly go through these. So for instance, the criteria we look at in order to protect the resource while still allowing you to conduct your project is we check whether the system that you're creating under your permit will not cause adverse water quantity impacts to receiving waters or adjacent lands. So you cannot flood your neighbor, basically. You want to protect your neighbor from if you put down impervious surface, you have less infiltration into the ground, you have more surface water runoff. We make sure that surface water runoff does not flood the roadway adjacent to your to the development or your neighbor. Does not cause adverse flooding to on or offsite properties. That's B. Does not cause adverse impacts to existing surface water storage and conveyance capabilities. Does not adversely impact the value of functions provided to fish and wildlife and listed species by wetlands and other surface waters. Does not adversely affect the quality of receiving waters or cause violations of water quality standards. That's where you have to make sure that your project treats the runoff sufficiently so that the runoff that ultimately is discharged from your site meets water quality standards. Does not cause adverse secondary impacts to water resources. I'll speak about secondary impacts in just a minute. Does not adversely impact maintenance of surface or groundwater levels or surface water flows. This goes back to the water supply and making sure that we have a thing called the minimum flows and levels, which is established through modeling and science, the minimum amount of water that a stream or water body can experience and still sustain its quality. And finally, does not cause adverse impacts to the works of the district. And the works of the district would be things like the locks and dams and the levees and things like that we maintain in order to protect our water resources and prevent flooding. In addition, if the activity, not every permit, not every ERP is located in wetlands or surface waters. However, if your project is located in wetlands and surface waters, an additional set of criteria come into play, which we also call the public interest test. And the public interest test is either, there's two parts to it. Either it is, well, there's two kind of flavors of it. There is the question whether or not the project that you're implementing is contrary to the public interest, or whether it's clearly in the public interest. And that has to do with the question whether or not the activity is going to impact or be located in what we call an outstanding Florida water body. Outstanding Florida water bodies are the most sensitive water bodies, aquatic preserves, and water bodies throughout Florida that have been recognized for their ecological and, in some cases, cultural significance. And if your project is located or is discharging directly to an outstanding Florida water body, it makes the permitting a little bit more complicated because you have to demonstrate to the agency that your project is clearly in the public interest. And how do you determine whether a project is either contrary to public interest or clearly in the public interest? It's a 7-part, we call it the 7 dwarfs, like a 7-part test, where we kind of balance the positives and the negatives of a project. And so those 7 tests are, we consider the public health, safety, and welfare of others. We look at conservation of fish and wildlife, including endangered or threatened species and habitats. We look at the navigation, flow of water, and harmful erosion or shoaling. We look at fishing or recreational values or marine productivity in the vicinity of the project. We determine we ask whether the project is a temporary or permanent in nature, whether the project will adversely affect any historical or archaeological resources. And finally, we look at the current condition and the relative functions provided by the affected area. And so an applicant can demonstrate to us, first of all, let's say that you are not in an outstanding Florida water body. An applicant can demonstrate to us that they're not contrary to public interest to make sure that those 7 things are at least balance neutral, meaning that you are providing sufficient protections through your design, that you're not adversely affecting, like for instance what Valerie was describing earlier with the eagle's nest, that you're avoiding those impacts to wildlife, that you are doing your best to minimize your impacts to wetlands and surface waters, and those that you can't avoid, that you're mitigating for those. So ultimately, there's a way to kind of get all of those things to be neutral. If you're in an outstanding Florida water body, you kind of have to do a little bit more. So the way that you can do more is, of course, do your best to minimize and avoid, but those things you can't minimize or avoid, then you have the opportunity potentially do a little bit more mitigation or do something that's kind of brings the project in, kind of balances the scale on the positive side. And that's ultimately where you could, meet that balance test. So quickly about the engineering criteria of an ERP. So in order to demonstrate that you're not causing flooding and to protecting water quality, the conventional water quality treatment systems that would be part of your design would include retention ponds. You see them all over the place, of course, under drains, exfiltration, wet detention ponds, and swales. Those are typically the types of things that we see in the design of systems that demonstrate to us that you're meeting both your water quality and your water quantity criteria. Sometimes we see innovative alternative water quality treatment systems. That includes things like stormwater harvesting, which is a way that if you have a project with a large stormwater pond, a wet detention pond, and you have the ability to design such that you have additional stormwater, there is the opportunity to what we call stormwater harvesting, which is to utilize that additional storage in order to, for instance, utilize it for irrigation on site. Reduce reliance on the water supply, or even provide that additional water to off-site users. Vegetative natural buffers is a way to get additional water quality treatment through letting the water run through areas that are vegetated and letting the vegetation of the ground absorb those pollutants. Compensating treatment would be to treat more than is needed in order to offset maybe shortfall somewhere else. Wetland stormwater management systems, those are utilizing wetlands in the natural ability of wetlands to absorb and treat pollutants in order to get additional water quality treatment. There's a thing called green roofs, which is a way to get water quality treatment actually through roof systems. Pervious pavement, which is pavement that actually allows infiltration into the ground. It's not entirely impervious. It actually allows the water to infiltrate through the pavement. And then something that's been used quite a bit lately is filters and biofilters, which are like the Bowling Gold, things like that, where it's a filter system that allows algae to absorb additional pollutants and increases the efficiency of some of the treatment systems. Those are all things that we have permitted and can be part of your design. So quickly switching over to the environmental criteria. So the regulatory scientists, which is the group that I've been working with mostly, when an application comes in, we look at the environmental criteria. And again, kind of like playing off what Mallory said earlier, the things that we look at is, for instance, first we look at elimination reduction of impacts. So has the applicant demonstrated to us that they have minimized to the greatest possible practical extent the impacts to wetlands? And that is a conversation that we tend to have with the applicant. If it looks like maybe there is ways that you can further avoid the impacts, those are conversations that we then have with the applicant. We look at, of course, direct wetland impacts that then remain. We look at secondary impacts, and then ultimately we'll look at mitigation. I'm going to quickly go over all of those in just a minute here. Okay, so the elimination and reduction of impacts. So we look at design modifications that could potentially eliminate or reduce those impacts. Shift the road maybe a little bit further to the west in order to avoid that wetland. Maybe shift some of the lots on your subdivision, away from the wetlands. Those are the kinds of things that we're looking for. Ultimately, but we do understand that not every avoidance is practicable. It could be that the road can't be shifted, or it could be that maybe shifting those lots is not feasible, and maybe losing X number of lots, makes your project no longer feasible as well. So we do recognize that, and we do our best to work with the applicants in order to kind of come ultimately to that the Goldilocks, right? It's like is it too hot, too cold, or is it just right? So ultimately, we hope to find that solution that gets there. As a regulator, I find that when we kind of hit that negotiating table, that if everybody walks away from the table a little bit mad, maybe everybody did their job, or maybe a little bit happy. Try to kind of hit that where everybody wins a little bit. All right. So what are the wetland impacts that we talk about? So if a project design cannot avoid the wetlands, so we already talked about reduction of impacts, but ultimately with those impacts that remain, what do we even call a wetland impact? So filling part or all of a wetland is a wetland impact. Dredging part or all of a wetland is a wetland impact, or direct wetland impact. Altering the hydrology by flooding, draining, or drawing down a wetland is considered a wetland impact. So it could be that you're maybe not directly filling a wetland, but you might be causing it to receive less water or more water than it had historically. So you're altering the hydrology of that wetland, which may affect ultimately a shift in the community that might be adverse to the critters that are currently using it or to the functioning of that wetland. Cutting, trimming, or removing desirable vegetation can be considered a wetland impact. Sometimes, depending on how it relates to your project, some of those activities might be exempt, but again, we do look at that whether or not it is, whether it's a wetland impact. Other topographical alterations that could affect adversely the system's ecological functions. So any of those things that would directly affect the functioning or the existence of a wetland or the surface water is what we call a direct wetland impact. So after we look at direct impacts, we also look at potential secondary impacts. Secondary impacts are impacts that affect the functioning of a wetland or surface waters that is, again, not resulting from a direct impact, but from typically the use of the system, the use of what you're doing that is in close proximity or adjacent to the wetland. So things that we're looking at, for instance, are collisions from vehicles or boats, wildlife avoidance or disruption due to lights or noise. You think about a forested system that, was a very nice big wetland forested system. A big box store comes in with a parking lot, nighttime lights and everything. And so the critters that are in that remaining wetland that's there, maybe you only impacted a third of the wetland, but the remaining wetland, those critters in there are now going to be affected by the fact that you have lighting all night that where you used to have darkness, so you have wildlife avoiding the area. Part of the life cycle can no longer occur in this area. And so that's considered a secondary impact for which an applicant needs to either demonstrate to us that they're minimizing or avoiding those secondary impacts, or if they can avoid them, mitigate for those impacts. The introduction of trash or invasive species, so development, the rear of lots and things like that, or recreational activities right next to wetlands, maybe with inadequate trash disposal, things like that. So you have cans and paper bags and things that blow into or fall into the wetland system. Those can all be things that we consider a secondary impact that just kind of decreases the function and the quality of that wetlands due to adjacent activities. Pet predation, cats running into the wetlands or dogs or any kind of pets running into the wetland, potentially predating on some of the critters in there. Impacts to water quality from septic tanks, treated wood, or boat hull paint. And for instance, common in the Indian River Lagoon is prop dredging from boats crossing seagrasses in shallow areas. All things we have to consider. So we do try to work with the applicant to avoid and minimize those secondary impacts. Ways that you can minimize those secondary impacts are you can leave a natural buffer around a wetland, a natural upland buffer around a wetland. You can design low-intensity uses next to the wetlands and connections to natural areas, so maybe shift some of your higher-intensity uses away from the wetland and have the lower-intensity uses of your project be closer to the wetland. If you have fill slopes that are next to wetlands, you can plant those fill slopes with native plants. You can have protective fencing and signs that designate conservation areas and use restrictions that would keep also potentially the pet predation out and keep people from potentially going and throwing their trash into the wetlands. And of course, when it comes to roadways and also boating, you can reduce the speed by establishing speed limits and providing wildlife crossings. Those are all things to reduce or eliminate your secondary impacts. So now we come to wetland mitigation. So we've gone through the design process. You've had your meeting with the regulators, and we've gotten to the point where we agree, okay, these are the impacts that we feel are appropriate for your development, but now you're going to have to mitigate for them. So there are many different types of mitigation. Mitigating is a way that you either on-site or off-site engage in a project or an activity that replaces the functional value of the wetlands that are lost or impacted by your project. So the types of mitigations include on-site or off-site preservation of wetlands and supporting uplands, on-site or off-site enhancement, restoration or creation of wetlands, the donation of land to preservation either to the district or to a third party, or the use of an improved mitigation bank, which Victoria I think is going to be talking to shortly, or a ROMA, which is a regional off-site mitigation area, which is typically a governmental project that allows for certain activities or certain mitigation to occur on preserved lands. So when we talk about mitigation, we have divided our district into, I think it's 22, let me see real quick, 23. Sometimes it shifts. So 23 different mitigation basins you can see there. Some of the basins are embedded in other basins. But generally, when you impact an area, we expect you, it goes right back to the watershed management, we expect you to mitigate and replace those functions in that same mitigation basin. There are ways to mitigate out of basin. We go through what's called a cumulative impact analysis, or more recently with Mitigation Bank, there's recent legislation, which I don't know if you can speak to that today or not, but that allows, after we go through a formal process, to potentially go what we call an out-of-service area, which is also a way to potentially mitigate in an adjacent basin once you go through a detailed review process. The impacts and mitigation are quantified through a method that's described in Chapter 62.345, which is the acronym UMAM, Uniform Mitigation Assessment Method. And for impacts and mitigation, under a UMAM, we score the locational landscape, which is the setting in which the wetland is in, the water environment, both the quantity and the quality of the water, and the community structure, which is essentially, does this system have, how appropriate is the current vegetation in that system compared to like the ideal of that type of habitat. And so we compare the score for the impact area, multiplied by the acres of the impact, then compare it to the value of your mitigation, if it's a mitigation project, other than, say, Mitigation Bank. We do a similar assessment on the mitigation side and multiply that by those acres. And in order to meet our criteria, your functional loss on the impact side has to be less than or equal to your functional gain. So your functional gain has to at least be as much as your functional loss, if not more. On the mitigation side, we also introduce what's called a time lag. Sometimes if you do enhancement or restoration activities, that's going to take years in order to fulfill, in order to meet what we call success criteria. So we introduce a time lag into the equation that addresses that you know, even though you're losing the wetland on day one that you're impacting, it might take 15 or 20 years for the mitigation restoration to be successful. And so there's a factor that goes into that, which reduces the value of that mitigation, so you have to write more mitigation because there's a time lag, because of that temporal displacement. There's also risk factor, which is an assessment of how, okay, promise you I'm almost done. There's also risk factor, which assesses the likelihood of failure or problems with the mitigation. If you're doing something that's really risky, something where maybe you have to get exactly the right type of hydrology. You know, we can't predict if in 15 or 20 years if you're going to reach that right hydrology. But of course, we're going to look at everything and try to get the best possible data up front to make sure it's the best possible project, and there's the greatest likelihood of reaching that. But we do calculate a risk factor if you're doing enhancement or restoration or creation. And finally, there's a preservation adjustment factor, which only applies to preservation areas, and that deals with if you're preserving wetlands and upland buffers, how is it situated? Is it connected to other preserved lands? How does it interact with the surrounding landscape? What is the management plan that's introduced? Things like that. So we evaluate how good this preservation plan is. All right, and then finally, 30 seconds real quick. I want to just quickly run through the entire ERP review process. So the steps to getting a permit is there's an optional pre-application conference. You then submit your application through our e-permit portal. So just about 99% of our applications are submitted through our website, through the e-permit portal. Our reviewers have 30 days to review, and if incomplete, the application, if incomplete, we send a letter out that's called Request for Additional Information. The applicant then has 90 days to respond to that RAI, or they can request an extension of up to an additional 90 days. Once the application is complete and meets all criteria which I described earlier, the district must act on the application within 60 days. And our goal is typically, once the application is complete, and we've reviewed all the criteria, is to issue that within 5 days, but we do have 60 days to do it. Our reviewers will draft what's called a technical staff report, which is the basis for the permit issuance, and then the permit is sent out to the applicant, which is now the permittee, with certain conditions that are associated with that permit, but then that gives them then the ability to move forward with their project. We're at the end, so I really appreciate your time. Thank you for staying with me.
Thank you, Mark. What a wealth of knowledge in there. Just to let everyone know, we will have all these presentations available. If you email Kelly, she'll send it out to you. There's a lot of good stuff in there that definitely could be used. So our final speaker today is Miss Victoria Bruce. Victoria is a UCF graduate and a Florida native. Victoria has devoted years to environmental causes in Florida. She has been in the wetland mitigation and habitat conservation industry since 2004. She began her work at 21 years old as an intern and now has over 20 years of experience in wetland mitigation and species conservation banking. Her work focuses on facilitating environmentally sound transactions, including the sale of both mitigation credits and mitigation banks to align development with conservation goals. As a city commissioner for Winter Springs since 2022, Victoria integrates strategic planning to expertise to enhance community infrastructure, promote sustainable urban growth, and prioritize environmental preservation. Her commitment to balancing development and conservation remains central to both her public service and professional endeavors. Please help me welcome Victoria.
Thank you so much. Victoria Bruce, the Mitigation Banking Group. Very honored to be here today with this esteemed panel. I joined VCARD yesterday, so I'm very, very excited to be a part of this organization. Today I'm going to speak about mitigation banking. What is it? How do you form it? What are the benefits? What are the cons? And so I'm going to go through a little bit about that and give you a little bit of education on wetland mitigation banking in Florida. So we heard about the impacts, the functional loss, but let's talk about the functional gain. How do we enhance, restore, preserve wetlands to be able to get that lift, that restoration value? And that's what a mitigation bank is. We fix broken swamps. So if there is a wetland and it is beautiful and gorgeous, there's nothing we can do. But if it's been ditched and drained and used for logging and agriculture and all these different activities throughout the years, we can actually manipulate it back to its natural state. And based off those efforts, the state and federal government will give us mitigation credits to sell to applicants within the same watershed. What happened? Oh. Sorry. I made this when I learned about transition, so I went a little nuts. Okay, so site selection. With a mitigation bank, that is the most important component. And if you look at 100 properties, you may find one that's suitable. And the reason for that is because they have to be large. Anywhere from, let's say, 150 acres is small, but that would be the smallest, all the way up to, 25,000 acres, which is the largest mitigation bank. But the sweet spot is about 600, 800 acres to be able to preserve and create a mitigation plan to be able to be eligible for a potential mitigation bank. Now, these regulators are very high scrutiny because this restoration activities will accommodate a lot of wetland loss in the future. So they are very diligent to make sure that these wetland mitigation banks are functioning and will reach success. These are activities of different sites that could be a potential mitigation bank, such as agriculture, cattle farms, timber farms, even a sand mine and borrow pit. Okay, so what are we looking for when we want to establish a mitigation bank? Degraded ecological conditions, ecological and hydrological issues. We restore the culverts, we remove the invasive species, we plant native species, we do prescribed fire. All these different restoration activities provide lift or functional gain or credits. Adjacent to another conservation land, big plus. Now you're creating like that missing corridor. If you're surrounded by other state lands, you are creating that corridor for wildlife. So they will provide more points for that. Threat of development, if you can show proof that this could be developed, that's also a higher ranking for you to get more credits and to be an eligible mitigation bank. And it's not just wetlands. A lot of people think it's a whole 600 acres of wetlands. It might be 60% wetlands and 40% uplands, or vice versa, or anywhere in between. So it's very important to understand the differences between that. And the big thing is the service area. And I have here the St. Johns River Water Management District that Mark had up on his slide. And I have these for all of the 5 water management districts. And this is the Holy Grail. And so if you are in Basin 14, if that's where your project is located, that is where you have to purchase mitigation credits from. Now, there is a new Senate Bill 492 that was adopted July 1st of 2025, and it changed the climate of the mitigation credit industry, but it's only if there are no mitigation banks left currently available in that basin that you could go over one basin more and provide 25% more mitigation, and every basin thereafter another 20%. So we want to stay in the basin, that's primary goal, but if there's nothing left, they are now allowing us to go to a different basin. Before this, many projects were stalled because there were no mitigation credits, there was no options, they couldn't do anything. So this Senate Bill 492 that Governor DeSantis signed last year really supports development and growth. Service area, your same watershed as where your bank is located. Now, each one of these basins, totally different story. You could be on one side of the train tracks and the other. This one's got 10 banks and this one's got 1 bank. This one's $300,000 of credit and this one's $100,000 of credit. So the main point of finding out what mitigation bank you can utilize is where your location is. Which drainage basin, which watershed, which HUC are you located in to determine which mitigation banks that you can provide. A lot of people think I'm in Broward County and I could mitigate up in Volusia County. No, it's got to be within the same watershed. So another big thing about developing a mitigation bank is the financial assurances. Developing a mitigation bank is not for the faint of heart. It costs about $1 million or so between permitting and the short-term and long-term financial assurances that need to be put up. So there's a lot of financial upfront money, a lot of risk to be able to hope that this project will be successful and that you can sell credits. Just because you have 600 credits doesn't mean you can sell them. So we've got to be very diligent on what the cost will be because it could be exorbitant. Okay, so you don't have to purchase a mitigation credit. You can do your own, and that's called permittee responsible mitigation. You can do on-site, where you do it on the same site as your project located, or off-site, which is in the same drainage basin, watershed, but at a different parcel. And you might need 10 to 20 acres of preservation for 1 acre of impact, or whatever it might be, depending on the quality. But with on-site and off-site mitigation, we have found that because it's sometimes not the developer, the applicant's primary focus, that sometimes it fails. And then they got to buy mitigation again twice. So mitigation credits really eliminate that risk and eliminate the time and the permitting because all of the work has been done. To get a mitigation bank permitted with St. John's, it's probably 2 to 3 years. With the Army Corps of Engineers, it's probably 8 to 10 years. So there is so much time that has been invested that now when your project needs credits, you just say, I need the 0.3 credits from Farm to Mitigation Bank. And so that will speed up the process and eliminate a lot of the legwork for the environmental consultant and yourself. Reduce time. If you purchase credits, it's already a functioning wetland, and they're approved by the state the federal government, Army Corps of Engineers. And depending on where it's located, it's either permitted within the water management district it resides in, and sometimes DEP will permit these mitigation banks if there might be a conflict of interest or there's some type of situation that you can obtain that. Okay, so we talked about this. This is on-site, off-site. There is more potential of the mitigation failing, and so when you purchase credits from a mitigation banker, you are transferring all the responsibility to that banker to make sure that the wetland is functioning properly. Mitigation banks are a collaboration of financial resources, ecological restoration, a lot of scientific things, and so it's a permit in itself, and it is a document or a contract with the agencies to make sure that you develop what you put in the permit. And you don't get all your credits at once. You get them in credit releases. You'll get about 20% when you file the conservation easement and you put up those short and long-term financial assurances. And then as you do the work, you'll get more. So you might get another 10% when you put up the fencing and signage. And then you get another 10% when you remove the invasives. And so on. And then at the very end, and it's normally a 5 year or so process, the very end you'll get the final success criteria, which shows that this bank is good and it's trending towards success. So, Volusia County, believe it or not, has a mitigation bank. And in 1996, they were one of the first to implement it. And I am their exclusive broker. So, Barberville Mitigation Bank is a wonderful restoration project. It's 1,000 acres. It's located in Basin 14, which is Wekiva to Wekalaka Basin. And it's right here in our backyard. So it's very rare for a state agency, county, city to have a mitigation bank, but there are instances where they are. Other mitigation banks that are permitted in Volusia County are Colbert-Cameron Mitigation Bank, which is 2,600 acres. And this provides mitigation for the St. Johns River Basin 18. And then we have the Farmington Mitigation Bank, which is the largest mitigation bank in the country, at 23,922 acres. And this one is a big dog and has a lot of credits left to sell, and very successful project. Neo Verde, also located in Volusia County, Basin 21, more on the Space Coast. About 10 years ago or so, one of my first banks that I sold was Neo Verde. And I was trying to convince the buyer that this is, home run. But how do I convince them? There were no banks in the basin, so we were the first one. So there was no historical demand. A lot of projects couldn't even move forward because there wasn't a bank. But with a wing and a prayer, thank goodness, someone from SpaceX wrote me and said, we need 200 credits. The deal closed next month. And they did purchase all the credits available and not even unreleased. So Blue Origin, SpaceX, NASA, they're all kind of fighting for these credits, and they're even developing their own banks now. Tiger Bay Mitigation Bank. We got GeoSam in the house that owns Tiger Bay Mitigation Bank, and this is a 24,000 acre parcel of land of restoration value. And it services Basin 17, which is the Halifax River Basin. Webster Creek. This is also in Volusia County. All of these are, by the way. And this one's a saltwater mitigation bank. State only, does not have federal credits, depending on which bank it is. Sometimes they only have state, sometimes they have state and federal. Very rarely do you have federal only. And so Webster Creek Mitigation Bank is actually, I thought 150 acres was the smallest, but I figured out yesterday it's actually 116. So this one provides state saltwater, herbaceous and forested marine credits to applicants that have saltwater impacts. The other ones that I've mentioned are all freshwater. And that's it. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Victoria. Don't go too far, though.
Okay.
We actually have we're gonna have a panel for you all. They're all gonna come up here, and you can ask them some questions. So before we get to that, I did want to say that we do have some upcoming VCARD events. On April 28th, we have Protecting Our Greatest Asset, Volusia County's coastline. And then on June 8th, we have the VCARD Golf Tournament. So if you want to sign up for any of those events, please go to our website. I also want to mention that this is being recorded visually and audibly, so that will be on the website as well. So if you need to rewatch any of this, we will have it available. So if you could come up to the panel, we'll be available for some questions.
Malaya Smith-Fergusa with Pulte. I was just wondering if you guys can explain a little bit about U.S. Army Corps impacts versus locally permitted impacts.
That's a great question. State versus federal. You need federal credits if the wetland is jurisdictional to another water body. And with WOTUS, things are changing all the time, what is connecting, what isn't, but it makes it more clear. And so you will need federal credits if it's connected to another water body, and you'll need state regardless if it's isolated or connected.
Right, and I'm just gonna bounce off, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm just gonna bounce off of that question real quick. So as part of the environmental assessment process, we typically have to assess which wetlands on a project site are jurisdictional to the feds, and we also know that all of the wetlands on your site, all of the surface waters on your site are jurisdictional to the state at any time. But we have to follow and do a lot of digging, a lot of historical research, do a lot of field work, a lot of forms or data forms called ordinary high watermark forms or routine determination forms that show an upland and wetland disconnect in order to figure out if that jurisdictional boundary extends onto your site or not. So it's a really great question. Projects are sometimes tied up by it right now. They are going through a potential rule change. There was just a public notice that was issued in the Federal Register that ended in January, so they should be taking that and the comments that were received to reissue a new Waters of the United States rule. So we'll see.
So this is a crazy question. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Where did I write it down? Do you use AI to generate wetland reports or permits?
Will you repeat the question? I didn't hear you.
Do you use AI? Are you using AI to generate wetland reports or permits?
No. I think that there is some benefit to AI, but I think in reality, all of the reports that at least, our group is producing and or my team is producing, maybe ChatGPT or AI might be used to double check something or, generate a summary of a report that someone else was issued. But no, everything that we're issuing in-house can't be generated from AI. Maybe Mark can speak on regulatory.
Yeah, so currently, the agency, St. John's, we don't use AI in generating our permits or anything like that. However, we are currently exploring the use of AI. We're right now in a pretty big IT rewrite of our whole regulatory system. And we are exploring limited use of AI to help assist us in our review. Some of the examples, for instance, one of the things that we've been testing is, for instance, for exemption requests. When somebody requests, gives us a description of their project, and we review the criteria, we review the details of the project, and then make a determination whether or not they need a permit. So one of the things that we've done is we are looking at, to what degree can AI look at that data and then then refer and utilize the rule and the statute in order to make a yes or no determination, yes or no, it needs a permit, and why does it need a permit. And so now it would not replace our decisions, but in these testings, we're kind of comparing it to decisions we've already made to see its accuracy. And with a little bit of tweaking, we've actually achieved a pretty high rate of accuracy, like 90-95%, where it makes the right determination that often. So we're looking to maybe integrate that to help assist our staff, and maybe at some point to actually have it on our website as an interface where we get a lot of calls from people with those types of questions, but where a user can maybe answer a few questions about their project and then, you know, the website through AI can maybe make an immediate recommendation with a caveat that says, you know, this is a recommendation, but we still, you know, recommend that, you know, come speak to us, whatever. So that's what we have. Another thing that we're looking at is to maybe assist us in summarizing. You know, we review, as I said before, we issued 3,600 permits, and that's about how many applications of various types we received last year. So there's a lot of documentation, a lot of reports and things that we receive. There's a lot of reviews. Some of these reports are hundreds and hundreds of pages. One of our reviewers, on average, will have 50, 60 concurrent projects on their dashboard at any one time. So they're super, super busy. So we are looking also potentially at AI to maybe help us you know, take a look at these reports and maybe give us a predetermined summary of important key aspects that we have to glean from that report. Again, we'll still look at that report, but maybe it'll summarize, you know, some of the facts that we need in order to accelerate and facilitate our review. So yes, the agency is looking at integrating AI into what we do, but as of right now, currently, you know, we don't have any AI processes in place.
Yes.
Still on. I had a funny story. A landowner, he has about 600 acres up in North Florida, and he said, I've submitted my application. I used AI to do the whole thing. And I said, wow, you're either the smartest or the other type of person in the room. Sent it to an environmental consultant that permits mitigation banks, and she said, So you got to make sure that you know what you're doing, and AI is not 100% foolproof.
Thank you all. I have a question for one of you, though, to Mallory Tatum, if I may. In your array of 4 different choices for the road placement near the Eagle's Nest and the wetland, and very happily you asked for audience input on it, so I think to offer a suggestion. And it would be a 5th option. To raise a question about why is that road needed. So could there be inquiry into the demand for the use of the road, and maybe use some of the funds that would have gone to the road to do things to divert need for an extra road in ways that would be agreeable and welcomed by the public. Some of the funds could also be used to recruit maybe some of the people in this room to do other things with the area around the wetland to make it a site, to make it an appealing site, maybe have musical concerts there, you know, call it like swamp sounds or, you know, something, and, you know, make the Eagle's Nest an attraction, maybe have other uses for the land. So in other words, the 4 choices might open up to a 5th choice, and it wouldn't be no development, it would be different development, and development that would be very much in keeping with Mark von Canal's Goldilocks goal, you know, of trying to get a balance, and really the goal of this whole morning of finding balance.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a great statement and question or suggestion. And you're correct, that was not outlined on that slide. However, something that your environmental consultant often has to deal with is what's called an alternative sites assessment. And as part of this process, we have to evaluate all of these different options, kind of like those 4 on the screen. But that 5th option, a no action alternative, is also what's evaluated. And so we describe the need, and usually that need comes from the demand that's identified by the local government, specifically in this case because it's a road, but you know, things like traffic counts or long range plans or a thoroughfare plan. But I'll pass it off to Clay now to let him talk more on the local government side.
Thank you. I can tell you that, yes, that is one of the critical aspects that happens every time a applicant comes into either the county or to the cities. Aside from wetlands, you talk to anyone around here, traffic is probably the #1 concern that they have. So what local governments have, as Mallory just referenced, everybody's got a long-range plan for their road network. The county has that, DOT has that. So that roadway network is all coordinated, and it ultimately is the city or the county who's making sure that the roadways that are needed are put in the right place. And yes, the number one option of adding or widening or improving the local network over adding is always going to be the number one option for the local government. There's just unfortunately situations many times that you cannot avoid that, and that's where you really stress the avoidance and minimization.
For that, the applicant's going to want highest and best use, so it might be difficult to obtain that.
Question for Victoria. If you could explain the difference between formal wetland banks, which you described up there, and ROMAs, or regional offsite mitigation areas, and also explain if there's a cost savings for ROMAs.
Yes, great question. So, like I said, you don't have to purchase a mitigation credit, but you can do off-site, and sometimes you do your own, and sometimes there's landowners that have it available to you. And so, if you do that, though, if you utilize an off-site mitigation area, the permitting time will be more than purchasing a credit. But you can incentivize an applicant saying that, these credits would save you X amount of dollars, and that's a way to approach it. But what do you think about that, Mallory?
So I think it's a great question, and sometimes when we're working with a developer or a local government, they don't always want the responsibility that comes with a ROMA, right? Because they are either taking ownership or they are placing a conservation easement over a parcel of land, and then they have to tell St. John's or DEP or Army Corps that they are going to maintain that land, they are going to keep up the invasive species level percentages, they are going to do yearly, quarterly maintenance and monitoring, and then that long-term maintenance and monitoring plan is now on them. And so that's not always the most feasible option, and quite frankly, not a lot of people want to take on that responsibility. So it's a lot easier and sometimes more beneficial to go purchase a mitigation banking credit from a regionally significant mitigation bank.
I think we got time for one, maybe two more.
So I think this is for Mallory, but it might be for Clay. I'm not sure. So wetlands get a lot of attention, as do our protected species, but less attention goes to uplands and their value, and especially that value in connecting uplands through the wildlife corridor. We all hear about the wildlife corridor. So at what stage in this process does it get addressed whether or not that particular development is going to impact the bigger picture, right? The wildlife corridor, the use of our, the expanse of our uplands and that sort of thing. And should it have ever happened before it gets to you, Mallory?
I'm going to go on past experience at Volusia County, and what we're looking at when we see a development coming in, and it's all part of the avoidance and minimization. Where is it located? What's north, south, east, west of it? What are the conditions around it? Is it part of any other larger plan, as you were referencing the wildlife corridor that's been adopted by the state? Those are all critical elements that are identified in being able to look at that. And I also want to go back to my discussion earlier when I was talking about the 1 acre wetland that's preserved in the middle of the parking lot for, SeaWorld. That provided no functional connectivity. And so therefore, it's important to save a wetland, but you want the wetland to have that connectivity and functional use. And I was asking Mallory about, unfortunately, folks feel that mitigation is an acre for acre situation. It's not. It's focusing on function. So therefore, that's where we at the local government, utilizing the GIS data, I can tell you that now in 2026 compared to what we had in 1986 when I started this fun little ride, is a completely different world. We've gone from the Flintstones to the Jetsons in one swoop. And so it helps us as the implementers of our policies. In Volusia County, you've got the Natural Resource Management Area, NORMA, and you also have the Environmental Corridor Overlay, ECO. Those are all part of your comp plan. That's where we have our basis here in Volusia County when we start looking at development applications and what's significant from a corridor perspective and what's not.
So those are all great points. And so from the regulatory agency's perspective, as the current the rules that we implement do not give us the ability in most cases to regulate the uplands directly. So, you know, if a project comes in and you're avoiding the wetlands, but you're developing all the uplands, unless you are within 25 feet of a wetland where we could potentially consider secondary impacts, if you're developing all these high-quality uplands by itself, the rules under ERP do not provide a lot of protection, if any protection, for those uplands. However, there's more of a carrot than a stick approach, which is that uplands are valued when it comes to avoidance and mitigation. Uplands are valued, you know, the formula in UMAM tends to value uplands higher than wetlands. That's not to say that wetlands aren't important, but just by nature, the fact that there is a greater pressure on developing uplands, and because by itself there is an inherent protection of these uplands, we place more value on their preservation. And so when we look at a proposal that involves protecting those corridors and preserving those uplands that maybe connect wetlands or provide important supporting upland habitat for wetlands, the developer can get a lot of bang for their buck for providing those. So it's more of a, you know, a carrot approach, which is that, you know, hey, if you can, and this becomes part of the discussions too, if you can avoid maybe some of these impacts and maybe not fragment the system, but maybe leave some of the connections so wildlife can go from the eastern to the western side, things like that, you know, we tend to incentivize that in those discussions and say, you know, you can, you know, maybe you can, you know, sometimes there's a little bit of horse trading again, this Goldilocks approach, which is that, hey, maybe there's some, you know, lower quality wetlands in the northwestern corner of your project. So how about you shift some of the development there, but at the same time then avoid some of these higher quality areas which provide important corridors and connections. And so we try to do our best to incentivize that to ultimately have that development plan that makes the most sense. There's a 50-foot minimum, 25-foot average, so it's got to be 25-foot average. Yes.
So the averaging gives you the flexibility, so if there's an area over on one area, you can increase that buffer.
Okay, we got one more.
I have a question for Victoria. The largest mitigation bank you showed in your slide is a lot of acreage to completely close off for development. So I was wondering if you could clarify if any development within mitigation bank boundaries is allowed and what the regulations are for that.
So you're saying, can you develop around a mitigation bank?
Within the boundaries of a mitigation bank. I was just wondering if that's
Oh,
allowed.
no. So there's a conservation easement on it, and there's absolutely no development. We recommend mitigation bankers sometimes carve out 5 acres so they can have a little hunting camp, and that's really a way to get around it. But other than that, there is absolutely no permanent structures allowed.
Right, so in order to get that mitigation bank permit, and maybe Mark can speak a little bit more better on this topic, but they have to place what's called a recorded conservation easement over that parcel of land that specifically dictates what can and cannot occur. And usually it's any development of any kind. Sometimes there's recreational trails or something like that, but usually it's, you know, a blanket statement. There can never be anything that's developed on this plot.
All right, thank you again. One other note I forgot to mention: there is another VCARD event May 1st. Actually, here we're gonna have we are partnering with APA to. It's actually we're gonna have a tour of this building and see how they kind of repurposed it. Really cool. Happy hour. And then one last thing: can we get a round of applause for our speakers? And to Hazen Construction again, thank you for sponsoring us. Have a great day.